The city of Seoul stretched out beneath Jinwoo like a sprawling canvas of neon lights and towering skyscrapers, a testament to humanity's resilience even in a world teetering on the edge of chaos. Gates, mysterious portals to dungeons filled with monsters, had appeared years ago, turning ordinary people into hunters, warriors blessed, or cursed, with supernatural abilities to combat the threats emerging from these rifts. Among them stood Sung Jinwoo, once the weakest E-rank hunter, now something far greater, though even he didn't fully understand the depths of his own power. Tonight, the air was thick with tension, the scent of ozone lingering from an earlier storm. Jinwoo moved through the shadows of an abandoned industrial district, his footsteps silent, his presence barely a whisper against the cracked concrete. His black coat fluttered slightly as he paused, golden eyes scanning the darkness ahead. Something was wrong. The usual hum of nocturnal insects was absent, replaced by an eerie silence that prickled the back of his neck. Then, they emerged, figures cloaked in shifting darkness, their forms wavering like ink spilled into water. Shadows. But not his own. These were different, twisted reflections of the soldiers he had summoned from the dead, their eyes glowing with malevolent crimson instead of his own cerulean command. One lunged, a blade of condensed darkness slicing toward his throat. Jinwoo reacted instantly, pivoting on his heel as he summoned his dagger, Kazel's fang, the obsidian edge gleaming under the dim moonlight. Steel met shadow with a resonating clang, sparks erupting from the impact. The force of the strike sent vibrations up his arm, but he didn't falter. Instead, he pushed forward, driving his knee into the attacker's gut before flipping the dagger in his grip and slashing upward. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering as if destabilized, but it didn't dissipate. Interesting, Jinwoo muttered, his breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. These weren't mindless monsters, they fought with precision, adapting to his movements as if they knew his style. Another shadow lashed out, tendrils of darkness erupting from the ground like spears. Jinwoo activated Ruler's authority, the air distorting as gravitational force crushed the attack mid-flight. He didn't stop there, his fingers twitched, and the ground beneath the shadow split open, jagged spikes of mana erupting in a deadly surge. The creatures screeched, their forms writhing as they were impaled, but to his shock, they began reforming almost instantly, their substance knitting back together like liquid night. A voice, cold, mocking, echoed from the darkness. "You cannot kill what is already dead, Shadow Monarch." Jinwoo's eyes narrowed. That title. Only one being had ever called him that. Ashborn. But this voice wasn't his. It was distorted, layered with something ancient and hungry. Before he could process it, the shadows converged, their bodies merging into a colossal figure, a monstrous doppelganger of himself, towering over him with a grin that split its face unnaturally wide. Jinwoo didn't hesitate. He called forth his own army, Igris, Beru, and the rest of his loyal shadows materializing in a surge of blue flame. The battlefield erupted into chaos, steel and darkness clashing in a symphony of violence. But even as he fought, a chilling realization settled in his chest. These weren't just random enemies. They were his shadows. Or rather, what they could have been. And if something was strong enough to corrupt his own power, what else was out there, waiting in the dark? The true battle had only just begun. The air inside the dimly lit chamber was thick with tension, the scent of damp stone and lingering magic pressing heavily against Jinwoo's senses. His shadow soldiers stood motionless behind him, their forms flickering like living darkness against the cavern walls. The last battle had left its mark, his body ached, his mana reserves were depleted, and the weight of his own doubts clung to him like a second skin. A low, guttural growl echoed through the chamber, sending a ripple of unease through his shadows. Jinwoo's grip tightened around the dagger in his hand as he turned slowly, his instincts screaming at him. The shadows ahead twisted unnaturally, writhing as though something far worse than mere monsters lurked within them. Then, from the abyss, stepped a figure, one that made his blood run cold. It was him. A perfect mirror of Jinwoo's own form, down to the scars and the cold, calculating glint in its eyes. The doppelganger smirked, flexing its fingers as shadows coiled around its arms, mimicking Jinwoo's own abilities. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" It taunted, its voice an eerie echo of his own. Jinwoo didn't respond. He couldn't. The sheer impossibility of facing himself, his own strengths, his own instincts, sent a jolt of fear through him. But fear wasn't an option. Not when failure meant more than just his own death. A sharp whistle of displaced air was his only warning before the doppelganger lunged. Jinwoo barely twisted aside in time, feeling the graze of his own dagger against his ribs. He countered with a sweeping kick, but his double anticipated it, flipping over him and landing gracefully. Shadows erupted from the ground, tendrils lashing out like whips. Jinwoo barely managed to raise his own in defense, the clash sending a shockwave through the chamber. "You're slow," the double sneered. "Is this all the great Shadow Monarch can do?" Jinwoo gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus. He couldn't win by brute force, not against someone who knew his every move. He needed to be unpredictable. With a sharp mental command, his shadow soldiers surged forward, engaging the doppelganger in a flurry of strikes. But the double merely laughed, raising a hand. To Jinwoo's horror, his own shadows froze, then turned on him. Betrayal. His own power, used against him. Jinwoo barely had time to react before his own Igris lunged at him, sword gleaming with deadly intent. He rolled aside, heart pounding. If his shadows were compromised, he was alone. But then, a blade flashed from the side, intercepting Igris's strike with a metallic screech. Jinwoo turned, stunned, as Cha Haein stepped between them, her silver hair whipping behind her. "You look like you could use some help," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. The doppelganger's grin widened. "How touching," it mused. "But she can't save you from what's coming." Before Jinwoo could ask what it meant, the ground beneath them trembled violently. Cracks spider-webbed across the floor, and from the depths emerged monstrous figures, not just shadows, but something worse. Creatures with jagged, obsidian hides and eyes that burned with malevolent intelligence. The secondary threat. Haein's grip on her sword tightened. "Jinwoo. What are these?" He didn't have an answer. But one thing was clear, this wasn't just a battle against himself anymore. This was something far more dangerous. And if they didn't find a way to fight together, they wouldn't survive. The cavernous depths of the red gate hummed with an eerie resonance, the air thick with mana as Jinwoo stepped forward, his shadow soldiers flanking him like a living tide. His instincts, honed through countless battles, prickled with unease. Something was off. The gate's usual oppressive silence had been replaced by the distant, rhythmic clang of steel, the echo of a fight already in progress. He signaled his shadows to hold position, then crept forward, his boots barely whispering against the uneven stone. Ahead, the tunnel widened into a vast chamber where flickering torches cast long, dancing shadows. At its center stood a lone figure, their back to Jinwoo, twin daggers flashing as they parried the relentless strikes of a towering A-rank monster, a frost-fanged direwolf, its maw dripping with icy venom. The stranger moved with fluid precision, each dodge and counter a blur of motion, but even their skill wasn't enough to turn the tide alone. The wolf lunged, its claws raking across the fighter's side, sending them skidding back with a pained hiss. Jinwoo didn't hesitate. With a thought, Igris and iron burst from the shadows, intercepting the beast mid-leap. The dire wolf snarled, twisting mid-air to avoid Igris's blade, only to meet Iron's fist crashing into its ribs with a bone-shattering crunch. The stranger whirled, daggers raised defensively, their sharp golden eyes locking onto Jinwoo with a mix of wariness and something else, recognition. "You," the stranger breathed, their voice low but carrying an edge of accusation. Jinwoo frowned. "Do I know you?" Before they could answer, the dire wolf recovered, howling as its body pulsed with freezing energy. Jagged ice spikes erupted from the ground, forcing Jinwoo to leap back while the stranger flipped gracefully over the attack, landing in a crouch beside him. "Save the questions for after we survive this," they snapped, then lunged back into the fray. Jinwoo's shadow surged forward, but the stranger didn't wait for backup. They weaved between Iron and Igris, their daggers carving arcs of silver light as they struck at the beast's legs, aiming to cripple its mobility. The dire wolf retaliated with a whip-like tail strike, but the stranger ducked, rolling beneath it before driving a dagger deep into its haunch. The monster roared, its movements growing sluggish as dark energy seeped from the wound. A poison? Jinwoo seized the opening. With a burst of speed, he closed the distance, his dagger plunging into the dire wolf's throat. The beast thrashed, its dying spasms shaking the chamber, before collapsing in a heap of frost and shadow. Silence fell, broken only by the stranger's labored breathing. They straightened, wiping blood from their lip, then turned to Jinwoo with an unreadable expression. "You're stronger than I expected," they admitted, though their tone lacked warmth. "Thanks," Jinwoo said dryly. "Now, who are you?" The stranger sheathed their daggers with deliberate slowness. "Yunisung. And if you're here, then the system's chosen you too." Jinwoo's pulse spiked. "You know about the system?" Yuna's lips curled into a bitter smirk. "Better than you, apparently. I've been tracking its anomalies for months. And you're the biggest one of all." Before Jinwoo could press further, the ground trembled. From the chamber's far end, a new wave of monsters emerged, their glowing eyes fixed on the two hunters. Yuna sighed, cracking her knuckles. Looks like we'll have to finish this conversation later. Jinwoo exhaled through his nose, weighing his options. He didn't trust her, but she clearly knew something vital. And right now, they had a common enemy. Fine, he said, summoning his shadows. But don't get in my way. Yuna laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Same goes for you, Shadow Monarch. The monsters charged. And the battle began anew. Jinwoo faces his own shadows. Solo leveling fanfiction, Part 4. The cavern trembled as Jinwoo's shadow soldiers clashed against the monstrous figures emerging from the abyss. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and blood, his breaths coming in sharp, controlled bursts. These weren't ordinary beasts, they moved with eerie precision, their attacks synchronized as if guided by a single, malevolent will. His instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. Then he saw it. One of his own shadows, a high-ranking knight he had summoned just moments ago, turned its blade against him. The strike came without warning, slicing through his shoulder before he could react. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but worse was the realization dawning in his gut. His own shadows were betraying him. You, Jinwoo growled, his voice raw with disbelief as he dodged another lethal swing. The knight's hollow eyes gleamed with an intelligence that wasn't his own. Behind him, more of his army twitched unnaturally, their movements jerking like puppets on strings. A low, mocking laugh echoed through the cavern. From the darkness, a figure stepped forward, tall, draped in shifting shadows, its face a distorted mirror of Jinwoo's own. Did you really think you were the only one who could command them? The voice was his, but warped, dripping with malice. The Shadow Monarch's true successor. Jinwoo's mind raced. This wasn't just a battle of strength, it was a battle of will. His opponent wasn't just stealing his shadows, it was rewriting their loyalty, twisting the very bond that had made them his. His fingers tightened around his dagger, but doubt gnawed at him. If he couldn't rely on his army, what was left? The doppelganger lunged, shadows erupting from its form like whips. Jinwoo barely rolled aside, the ground where he'd stood exploding into rubble. He countered with a blast of dark energy, but his enemy absorbed it effortlessly, grinning. You're weak, it taunted. You never understood the real power of the shadows. You just borrowed it. Jinwoo's chest burned, not just from exertion, but from the truth in those words. He had always been the hunter, the one in control. Now, he was prey. His eyes flickered to the remaining shadows still fighting for him, fewer now, their numbers dwindling. He needed a new strategy. Fast. Then, an idea. A desperate, reckless idea. Instead of summoning more shadows, he released them. The remaining knights dissolved into smoke, their energy surging back into him. The doppelganger paused, confused, as Jinwoo's body flared with unchecked power. You want them? Jinwoo spat. Then take them all at once. With a roar, he channeled every ounce of his strength into a single, concentrated blast, not at his enemy, but at the cavern ceiling. The stone shattered. Sunlight, pure and blinding, poured through the fissures. The doppelganger shrieked, its form writhing as the light seared its shadowy flesh. Jinwoo didn't hesitate. He plunged his dagger into its chest, pouring his remaining mana into the strike. The creature's screams faded into silence as it dissolved into nothingness. But victory tasted hollow. Around him, the cavern lay in ruins, his shadows gone, not stolen, but sacrificed. He slumped to his knees, exhaustion and grief crashing over him. He had won, but at what cost? And then, from the darkness, a whisper. You still don't understand, Jinwoo. His head snapped up. The voice wasn't the doppelganger's. It was older. Deeper. The true enemy had only just begun to play its game. The air inside the dungeon was thick with the scent of damp stone and the faint metallic tang of blood. Jinwoo stood at the center of the cavern, his breath steady despite the weight pressing against his chest. The shadows around him writhed, not as extensions of his will, but as something else, something hostile. His own creation had turned against him, and now, the very power he'd relied on threatened to consume him. A low growl rumbled through the chamber as the shadow soldiers he'd once commanded stepped forward, their hollow eyes burning with an eerie crimson light. They moved with eerie precision, their forms flickering between solid and incorporeal, testing his defenses. Jinwoo tightened his grip on his dagger, the blade humming with residual mana. He couldn't afford hesitation. If he faltered now, the shadows would drag him into the abyss, permanently. The first strike came without warning. A shadow lunged, its dagger aimed for his throat. Jinwoo twisted, barely avoiding the slash, and countered with a swift kick to its midsection. The creature staggered but didn't dissolve. That was new. Before, his attacks would have shattered them instantly. Now, they resisted. His own strength was being used against him. He gritted his teeth and activated Dominator's touch, but the shadows merely shuddered, they didn't bow. A cold realization settled over him. They weren't just rogue summons, they were evolving, adapting to his techniques. He needed a new approach. A flicker of movement to his left. Jinwoo pivoted, slashing upward, but the shadow melted into the ground before reforming behind him. Its blade grazed his shoulder, drawing blood. He hissed, rolling away as another shadow materialized above, slamming down with crushing force. The ground cracked beneath the impact, sending jagged fissures spider-webbing across the floor. He couldn't fight them head-on. Not like this. Ducking behind a stalagmite, Jinwoo forced his breathing to steady. His shadows had always been extensions of his will, but what if he stopped treating them as enemies? What if he embraced their defiance instead of resisting it? A gamble. But he was out of options. Closing his eyes, he reached inward, not with force, but with acknowledgement. The shadows pulsed in response, their movement slowing. One stepped forward, its form shifting, features becoming clearer, until Jinwoo was staring at a perfect replica of himself. The doppelganger tilted its head. You finally understand. Jinwoo exhaled sharply. You're not my enemy. The shadow smirked. No. We are you. And then it lunged. This time, Jinwoo didn't dodge. He met the strike with his own blade, sparks flying as steel clashed. The impact sent tremors up his arm, but he held firm. Around them, the other shadows watched, their aggression waning. They were testing him. Not to destroy him, to force him to evolve. He pushed forward, channeling mana into his legs, and spun, sweeping the shadow's feet out from under it. Before it could recover, he drove his dagger down, but stopped just short of its throat. The shadow laughed. Good. And then the cavern erupted in motion. The remaining shadows surged forward, but not to attack. They merged with him, their essence flowing into his body like a tidal wave of power. His muscles burned, his veins alight with raw energy. The system's notifications blared in his mind, but he ignored them. This wasn't about stats. This was about control. When the last shadow fused with him, Jinwoo opened his eyes, and the dungeon trembled. The walls cracked, debris raining from above. He had minutes, maybe seconds, before the entire structure collapsed. But he wasn't done yet. Sprinting toward the exit, he felt the ground give way beneath him. A chasm split the floor, molten lava bubbling up from below. Jinwoo leapt, barely clearing the gap, and rolled as he landed. The heat seared his skin, but he didn't slow. A roar echoed from deeper within the dungeon. The real threat wasn't the shadows, it was what they'd been holding back. A monstrous figure emerged from the darkness, its body composed of swirling shadows and jagged bone. The dungeon boss. And it was hungry. Jinwoo smirked. Let's see what you've got. The creature charged, its massive claws tearing through stone like paper. Jinwoo ducked under the first swing, countering with a mana-infused punch to its ribs. The impact sent shockwaves through the beast, but it barely flinched. A backhand sent Jinwoo flying, his body crashing through a pillar. Pain flared, but he forced himself up. The boss was stronger than anything he'd faced before. But he had one advantage, it didn't know him. Activating stealth, Jinwoo vanished from sight. The beast snarled, swinging blindly, demolishing chunks of the dungeon in its rage. Jinwoo circled, waiting for the perfect moment. Then, strike. He reappeared above it, driving his dagger into the creature's spine. It howled, thrashing, but Jinwoo held on, channeling pure shadow energy into the wound. The beast's form flickered, its body destabilizing. With a final roar, it exploded into a storm of darkness, and Jinwoo absorbed every last wisp. The dungeon collapsed around him, but he was already moving, bursting through the exit just as the ceiling caved in. Panting, he looked down at his hands. The shadows coiled around his fingers, obedient once more, but different. Stronger. He grinned. This was just the beginning. The air crackled with energy as Jinwoo stood at the center of the battlefield, his breath steady despite the weight of what lay ahead. Shadows writhed around him, not just his own but ones that mirrored his every move, twisted reflections of himself, each carrying the same deadly precision. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a reckoning. The first shadow lunged, its dagger flashing in a blur of darkness. Jinwoo twisted, narrowly avoiding the strike as he countered with a sweeping kick. The impact sent the shadow skidding back, but it recovered instantly, its form rippling like liquid night. Before Jinwoo could press the advantage, another shadow struck from his blind spot, a fist aimed at his ribs. He barely managed to pivot, taking the blow on his forearm, the force rattling his bones. Gritting his teeth, he retaliated with a burst of mana-infused speed, driving his elbow into the shadow's throat. It dissolved into smoke, only to reform seconds later. They adapt too fast. He couldn't rely on brute force alone. These shadows weren't mere copies, they learned, evolved, just as he had. If he wanted to win, he'd have to outthink himself. With a sharp exhale, Jinwoo activated Dominion's grasp, the gravitational force surging outward. The shadows staggered under the sudden pressure, their movement sluggish. Seizing the opening, he blurred forward, his daggers carving arcs of black flame. One shadow fell, then another, but the rest adjusted quickly, their own auras flaring as they resisted his control. A shadow with elongated claws slashed downward. Jinwoo barely ducked, feeling the air part above his head. He retaliated with a spinning kick, but the shadow caught his ankle and hurled him into the ground. Pain flared through his back as the earth cratered beneath him. Before he could recover, 3 more shadows descended, their weapons gleaming. Ruler's authority. The command tore from his throat, and the world lurched as space itself bent to his will. The shadows froze mid-strike, suspended in time. Jinwoo rolled aside just as the effect shattered, their attacks colliding with the ground in a thunderous explosion. Dust billowed, obscuring his vision, but he didn't need to see. His instincts screamed danger, and he dropped low as a whip-like tendril of shadow lashed where his head had been. He countered with shadow exchange, swapping places with one of his own summoned shadows. The enemy's strike cleaved through empty air as Jinwoo reappeared behind it, his dagger plunging into its back. Black mist erupted, but he was already moving, weaving through the battlefield like a wraith. The shadows weren't just mimicking his skills, they were refining them. One unleashed Dominion's grasp, pinning Jinwoo mid-step. His muscles locked, veins bulging as he fought against the crushing weight. Another shadow lunged, its dagger aimed for his heart. Not like this. With a roar, Jinwoo forced Bloodlust to activate, his body igniting with raw power. The gravitational hold shattered as he sidestepped the killing blow, his own dagger slashing upward. The shadow's head flew, dissipating before it hit the ground. But the others didn't falter. They converged, their movements synchronized, a deadly dance of blades and shadows. Jinwoo's mind raced. He couldn't overpower them, not like this. He needed to change the rules. Dodging a flurry of strikes, he focused inward, calling upon the depths of his mana. The shadows didn't just mirror his strength, they mirrored his limits. But what if he pushed beyond them? Arise! The command was quiet but carried the weight of a storm. The battlefield trembled as his own shadows, his legion, erupted from the ground, their crimson eyes burning with loyalty. They surged forward, clashing with the enemy shadows in a maelstrom of darkness. Jinwoo didn't stop there. He channeled every ounce of his energy, his body radiating an eerie glow as Shadow Monarch's blessing fully awakened. His senses sharpened. Time seemed to slow. A shadow lunged, its blade a hair's breadth from his throat, until Jinwoo's hand snapped up, catching the weapon mid-air. With a twist, he shattered the dagger and drove his fist through the shadow's chest. It exploded into motes of darkness, but Jinwoo was already spinning, his leg sweeping out to decapitate another. The remaining shadows hesitated. For the first time, they faltered. Jinwoo didn't give them a chance to recover. He blurred forward, his movements a hurricane of precision and fury. Daggers clashed, sparks flying as shadow met shadow. He ducked, weaved, countered, every motion flawless, every strike lethal. One by one, the enemy shadows fell, dissolving into the abyss from which they came. The last one stood before him, its form flickering like a dying flame. Jinwoo met its gaze, seeing his own reflection in its hollow eyes. Then he struck. The final shadow shattered, the battlefield falling silent. Breathing heavily, Jinwoo straightened, his body aching but his spirit unbroken. This had been more than a battle, it had been a test. And he had passed. But as the dust settled, a new presence made itself known. A figure stepped from the darkness, its aura suffocating, its power dwarfing even the shadows Jinwoo had just faced. The real fight was only beginning. Jinwoo faces his own shadows. Solo leveling fanfiction, Part 7. Blood dripped from Jinwoo's lip as he staggered back, his breath ragged. The cavern around him trembled, chunks of obsidian raining from the ceiling as his own shadows, twisted, corrupted reflections of himself, closed in. They moved with his speed, his precision, their crimson eyes gleaming with malice. Every strike he landed, they mirrored. Every evasion, they anticipated. It was like fighting a nightmare version of himself, one that knew his every move before he made it. This is impossible. The thought flickered through his mind, but he crushed it immediately. He had faced worse. Survived worse. One of the shadow clones lunged, its dagger aimed for his throat. Jinwoo twisted, barely avoiding the blade, but another slammed a fist into his ribs. Pain exploded through his side, and he gritted his teeth, retaliating with a brutal kick that sent the clone skidding back. But before he could press the advantage, two more were already upon him. His shadows weren't just copies, they were better. Faster. Stronger. A blade grazed his arm, drawing blood, and Jinwoo hissed. His grip on his dagger tightened. He couldn't keep this up. If he didn't find a way to break through, they'd wear him down until there was nothing left. Then, a voice. "You're thinking too small." Beru's voice echoed in his mind, faint but clear. The Ant King's presence was weak, suppressed by whatever dark power had twisted Jinwoo's own shadows against him, but his words cut through the chaos. "They are you. But you are more." Jinwoo's eyes narrowed. More? What did that even mean? Another clone struck, and this time, Jinwoo didn't dodge. He let the blade sink into his shoulder, gritting his teeth against the pain, and grabbed the clone's wrist. The shadow's crimson eyes widened in surprise. "I'm not just a fighter," Jinwoo growled. And then he pulled. The shadow resisted, its form flickering, but Jinwoo poured every ounce of his will into the act. This wasn't just about strength. It was about dominance. He was the Shadow Monarch. These were his shadows. And they would obey. The clone shuddered, its edges wavering like smoke caught in the wind. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, it collapsed not into nothingness, but into pure darkness, swirling into Jinwoo's own shadow. A surge of power rushed through him. His wounds stitched themselves together, his fatigue lessened. The remaining clones hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in their eyes. Jinwoo smirked. "Now we're even." He moved. No hesitation, no doubt. His dagger flashed, carving through the nearest shadow before it could react. It dissolved instantly, absorbed into him. The next lunged, but Jinwoo was already pivoting, driving his elbow into its throat. Another fell. They were learning. Adapting. But so was he. The cavern shook again, deeper this time. Cracks spider-webbed across the floor, glowing with eerie violet light. Something was coming. Jinwoo didn't have time to wonder. The last two shadows attacked in unison, blades crossing toward his neck. He dropped low, sweeping a leg out to trip one, then drove his dagger up into the other's chest. It gasped, a disturbingly human sound, before dissolving. The final clone scrambled back, but Jinwoo was already upon it. His hand closed around its throat, lifting it off the ground. Enough. The shadow thrashed, its fingers clawing at his arm, but Jinwoo's grip was iron. He could feel it, the resistance, the struggle. This wasn't just a mindless copy. It knew him. Feared him. And that was its mistake. With a final wrench of will, Jinwoo crushed the shadow's defiance. It let out a choked cry before melting into darkness, surging into him like a wave. Silence. Jinwoo stood alone, breathing hard. His body thrummed with power, stronger than before. But the fight wasn't over. The ground beneath him split. A massive hand, skeletal and wreathed in violet flame, erupted from the fissure, slamming down where Jinwoo had stood moments before. He rolled to his feet just in time to see the rest of the creature emerge, a towering figure of bone and shadow, its hollow eyes burning with the same eerie light as the cracks in the floor. The true enemy. Jinwoo's grip tightened on his dagger. He was exhausted. Bloodied. But he had come too far to lose now. The monstrous construct lunged, its clawed fingers raking toward him. Jinwoo ducked, countering with a slash across its wrist. The blade bit deep, but the creature didn't flinch. It backhanded him, sending him crashing into the cavern wall. Stone shattered behind him. Pain flared down his spine. "Get up." He forced himself to stand, just as the creature reared back for another strike. But this time, Jinwoo wasn't alone. A blur of motion, Igris materialized beside him, sword already swinging. The blade carved into the creature's arm, forcing it back. Tusk's massive form barreled into its side, knocking it off balance. Shadows, his shadows, surged forward, attacking in unison. Jinwoo grinned. The battle wasn't over yet. With a roar, he charged, dagger gleaming, his army at his back. The final clash had begun. The air hung thick with the scent of charred earth and lingering mana, the battlefield still crackling with residual energy from Jinwoo's breakthrough. His body ached, muscles screaming from the strain of pushing past his limits, but the victory had come at a cost. The shadows he commanded, once an extension of his will, now writhed unpredictably at his feet, their forms flickering like unstable flames. He clenched his fists, forcing them to steady, but the effort sent a sharp pang through his skull. Something was wrong. Across the ruined landscape, Beru staggered to his feet, his carapace cracked and oozing dark fluid. "My king," he rasped, voice strained. "The shadows. They resist you." Jinwoo didn't need the reminder. The bond between him and his army had always been absolute, but now it felt frayed, as if something foreign had seeped into the connection. He turned his gaze to the crater where the final clash had erupted, where the enemy, a monstrous entity born of corrupted mana, had dissolved into nothingness. Or so he'd thought. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the silence. From the shadows of the crater, a figure emerged, not a beast, but a man. His features were eerily familiar, his smirk a perfect mirror of Jinwoo's own. The doppelganger stretched his arms, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off stiffness. "Took you long enough to notice," he taunted, his voice dripping with amusement. Jinwoo's blood ran cold. This wasn't just an illusion or a trick of the light. The figure before him radiated the same overwhelming presence, the same predatory grace. Worse, the shadows at the impostor's feet obeyed him without hesitation, coiling around his legs like loyal hounds. Beru hissed, wings flaring. "An echo? A remnant?" "No," Jinwoo muttered. "It's me." The doppelganger lunged. The clash was instantaneous, a blur of motion too fast for ordinary eyes to follow. Jinwoo barely raised his daggers in time to block the strike, the impact rattling his bones. His double didn't fight like an imitation, he fought like Jinwoo at his peak, every move calculated, every feint a masterstroke. Worse, he knew Jinwoo's patterns, anticipating his counters before he could execute them. Jinwoo ducked a swipe aimed at his throat, rolling to the side as his shadow clone surged forward. But the doppelganger merely smirked, snapping his fingers. The clones froze mid-strike, then shattered into wisps of darkness. "They're mine too, you know," the impostor chuckled. Jinwoo's mind raced. If brute force wouldn't work, he needed to outthink himself. He feigned a stumble, baiting his double into a downward slash, then twisted, using the momentum to kick a chunk of rubble into the air. The doppelganger batted it aside, but Jinwoo had already vanished, reappearing behind him with a dagger aimed at his spine. The impostor vanished just as quickly. A fist slammed into Jinwoo's ribs from the side, sending him skidding across the ground. He coughed, tasting blood. His double wasn't just copying him, he was evolving, adapting faster than Jinwoo could adjust. Beru swooped in, claws slashing, but the doppelganger sidestepped with effortless grace, catching the Ant King's wrist and hurling him into a nearby pillar. Stone crunched as Beru impacted, his body momentarily pinned. Jinwoo forced himself upright, wiping his mouth. He couldn't win like this. Not head on. His eyes darted to the ruins around them, collapsed walls, shattered pillars, the remnants of the battlefield. An idea sparked. He lunged again, this time deliberately telegraphing his strike. The doppelganger grinned, stepping into the counter, only for Jinwoo to abruptly pivot, slamming his palm into the ground. A shockwave of mana erupted, destabilizing the already fragile terrain. The earth beneath the impostor's feet gave way, swallowing him into a sinkhole of debris. For a heartbeat, Jinwoo thought it was over. Then the rubble exploded outward. The doppelganger rose, unharmed, his laughter ringing through the dust. "Clever," he admitted. "But you can't trap what you are." Jinwoo's breath came ragged. His body was reaching its limit, his mana reserves dwindling. But surrender wasn't an option. If this thing was a manifestation of his own power, of his shadows, then there was only one way to end it. He closed his eyes, reaching inward. The shadows within him writhed, resisting, but he didn't force them. Instead, he let go. The doppelganger's smirk faltered as Jinwoo's form flickered, his body dissolving into pure darkness. Not attacking. Not defending. Just existing. "What are you?" Jinwoo didn't answer. He simply was. And in that moment of perfect stillness, the doppelganger hesitated. Beru struck from above, his claws shearing through the impostor's shoulder. The doppelganger roared, whirling to retaliate, but Jinwoo reformed behind him, dagger flashing. The blade found its mark. The doppelganger staggered, his form shuddering. "Impossible," he rasped. You let them go." Jinwoo yanked the dagger free. "I am their master," he said quietly. "Not their prisoner." The doppelganger's body fractured, cracks of light spreading through his silhouette before he burst into a shower of dissipating shadows. Silence fell. Jinwoo collapsed to one knee, exhaustion crashing over him. Beru limped to his side, his injuries severe but not fatal. My king. What was that? Jinwoo stared at his trembling hands. A warning, he murmured. The system's final gift. The shadows at his feet stirred, no longer resisting, but not entirely his own. Something had changed. And as the wind howled through the ruins, carrying the scent of impending storm, Jinwoo knew the true battle was only beginning. Around them, the world seemed to hold its breath. Waiting. The air inside the ruined cathedral was thick with the scent of blood and ozone, the remnants of their last battle still clinging to the shattered stone. Jinwoo panted, his muscles screaming from exertion, the shadows at his feet writhing in agitation. Across from him, Beru's fractured carapace gleamed under the dim light, his mandibles clicking in warning. My liege, the ant hissed, they are coming. Jinwoo didn't need to ask who. The weight of the approaching presence pressed against his senses like a suffocating tide, his own shadows, twisted and given form, a grotesque reflection of his power. They had been hunting him since the gate's collapse, and now, with his allies scattered and wounded, there was no more running. Heian wiped sweat from her brow, her spear trembling in her grip. We can't keep fighting like this, she muttered. They're adapting too fast. Jinwoo clenched his fists. She was right. Every time they struck, the shadow clones learned, countering their moves before they could land another blow. If they didn't change tactics now, they'd be overwhelmed. A sharp crack echoed as Igris slammed the hilt of his sword against the ground, drawing their attention. The knight's crimson eyes burned with urgency. He didn't speak, but the message was clear, they needed a plan. Jinwoo exhaled, forcing his mind to focus. They mimic me, he said. But they don't just copy my strength, they copy my instincts. My habits. His gaze flickered to the broken pillars around them, the shattered remnants of stained glass littering the floor. Which means they'll expect me to lead. Heian's eyes widened. You're saying we use that against them? A grim smile tugged at Jinwoo's lips. Exactly. He turned to Beru. You and Igris will take point, act like you're following my orders, but the moment they commit to countering me, you break formation. Heian, you'll need to time your strikes perfectly. If we're off by even a second, we're dead, she finished. The ground trembled. Shadows pooled at the far end of the hall, tendrils of darkness coiling into familiar shapes, Jinwoo's own face staring back at him, smirking. No more time. Now, Jinwoo roared, lunging forward. His shadow clones mirrored him instantly, blades flashing as they intercepted his charge. Just as predicted. Beru and Igris moved as one, feigning obedience before abruptly veering left, their weapons carving through the distracted clones. Heian darted in from the side, her spear aimed at the largest shadow's blind spot, but it twisted at the last second, its arm elongating into a whip of darkness. Jinwoo barely yanked her back in time. Damn it. The clones weren't just learning, they were evolving. Glass crunched underfoot as Jinwoo staggered back, his mind racing. They needed something unpredictable. His eyes landed on the shattered windows above. A reckless idea took hold. Beru. He barked. The chandelier, bring it down. The ant didn't hesitate. In a blur of motion, he shot upward, his claws slicing through the rusted chains. The massive iron fixture plummeted, crashing into the center of the shadow clones with a deafening boom. Dust and debris exploded outward, but even before it settled, Jinwoo was moving. He snatched a jagged shard of stained glass from the floor, its edges glinting like a dagger. Not a weapon he'd ever choose, but that was the point. The first clone lunged from the smoke, and Jinwoo sidestepped, driving the glass into its throat. It shrieked, dissolving into ink-black mist. Another came from behind, but Igris intercepted it, his blade locking with the shadows before Heian's spear pierced its chest. They were holding. Barely. Then the largest clone stepped forward, its form shifting, expanding, until it wasn't just mimicking Jinwoo anymore. It was mimicking the monarchs. Jinwoo's blood turned to ice. Fall back. Too late. The clone's hand shot out, dark energy erupting in a wave that sent them all flying. Jinwoo slammed into a pillar, pain lancing through his ribs. Across the room, Heian groaned, struggling to rise. Beru's wings were crumpled, Igris's armor cracked. They were out of time. Out of options. Unless. Jinwoo forced himself upright, his voice raw. One last gamble. Heian met his gaze, understanding dawning. You can't be serious. They're part of me, he said. Which means they're connected to my shadow army. His fingers twitched, summoning every remaining soldier from the void. If I let them in, let them try to consume me, I can turn their own power against them. Beru hissed in protest. The backlash could destroy you. Jinwoo's smile was all teeth. Then we'd better make it count. The clone surged forward. Jinwoo didn't resist as the darkness swallowed him whole. Inside the abyss, his own voice whispered, mocking. You've lost. Jinwoo closed his eyes, and unleashed his will. The shadows screamed. Outside, Heian saw the clones convulse, their forms flickering. Now, she shouted. Igris's blade flashed. Beru's claws tore. Heian's spear struck true. And Jinwoo? He ripped his way free, his hands closing around the largest clone's throat. No, he growled. You lose. With a final, shuddering gasp, the shadow shattered. Silence. Then Jinwoo collapsed. Heian caught him before he hit the ground, her hands trembling. You idiot, she whispered. Jinwoo's laugh was weak. Worked, didn't it? Around them, the cathedral groaned, its ruined walls trembling. The battle was won, but the war wasn't over. And the final fight loomed. Jinwoo stood at the precipice of the abyss, his breath steady despite the weight of exhaustion pressing against his bones. The shadows around him writhed like living things, whispering secrets of the battle to come. Before him, the final fragment of his own darkness, a twisted mirror of himself, forged from every doubt and regret he had ever buried, sneered with a familiarity that made his blood run cold. You thought you could outrun me? The shadow hissed, its voice dripping with venom. I am you. And today, you die by your own hand. The air crackled with tension as Jinwoo tightened his grip on his dagger, the blade humming with residual energy. There was no time for hesitation. With a roar, he lunged, his body a blur of motion as he aimed for the shadow's throat. But his doppelganger was faster, sidestepping with eerie grace before countering with a sweeping kick that sent Jinwoo skidding across the fractured ground. Pain flared in his ribs, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through it. This was it, the culmination of everything. The shadow advanced, its form shifting like smoke, and Jinwoo barely raised his arms in time to block a crushing blow aimed at his skull. The impact rattled his bones, but he retaliated with a burst of mana, channeling it into a devastating punch that sent his opponent reeling. The shadow hissed, its features twisting in rage, and then the real fight began. Blades clashed in a storm of steel and darkness, each strike faster than the last. Jinwoo feinted left, then spun low, his dagger carving a vicious arc toward the shadow's side. But his double anticipated the move, parrying with a flick of its wrist before driving a knee into Jinwoo's gut. He coughed blood, staggering back, but refused to fall. He couldn't. Not now. With a snarl, Jinwoo unleashed his shadows, the loyal legion of fallen foes surging forward like a tidal wave. They crashed into the doppelganger, tearing at its form, but the shadow merely laughed, a sound that sent chills down Jinwoo's spine. You think these puppets can stop me? It mocked, before dissolving into the darkness and reforming behind him. A blade plunged toward Jinwoo's back, but instinct saved him. He twisted at the last second, the edge grazing his shoulder instead of piercing his heart. Blood dripped onto the ground as Jinwoo panted, his vision swimming. He was running out of time. Out of options. But then he remembered, his father's words, Igris's loyalty, Beru's sacrifice. This wasn't just his fight. It was theirs, too. Summoning every ounce of strength, Jinwoo reached deep into his core, where the last embers of his power still burned. The shadows around him flared to life, merging with his body until he became something more, something unstoppable. With a final, thunderous cry, he charged. The clash was cataclysmic. Fists met fists, blades locked, and the very air trembled as the two forces collided. Jinwoo's dagger found its mark, sinking into the shadow's chest, but the doppelganger only grinned, its hand closing around Jinwoo's throat. You lose, it whispered. But Jinwoo smiled back. No. We win. With that, he unleashed the last of his mana in a blinding explosion, the force of it consuming them both. Light swallowed the darkness, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. When the dust settled, Jinwoo lay on the ground, battered but alive. The shadow was gone, destroyed by his own hands. The world around him was different now, the sky clearing for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The battle was over. But victory came at a cost. His shadows, his loyal army, were scattered, their forms dissipating into the wind. Igris stood beside him, his armor cracked, and Beru's voice echoed faintly in his mind before fading entirely. They had given everything for this moment. Jinwoo closed his eyes, letting the weight of it all settle over him. He had faced his darkest self and emerged stronger. The world would never be the same, but perhaps that was for the best. As the sun rose on a new dawn, Jinwoo took his first steps into the future, alone, but unbroken. The shadows would always be a part of him, but now, he was the one who controlled them. And that was enough. Word count, 2000.